My cousin Brian went in with the best studio musicians in LA. They called themselves the Wrecking Crew.
Los Angeles. News tickers hadn't finished flashing the June 11, 2025 death notice of Beach Boys architect Brian Wilson, 82, before social media flooded with tributes from Paul McCartney, Billie Joe Armstrong, and presidents past and present. Yet one name stayed eerily silent: Mike Love. Actor-musician John Stamos told ABC News he was in an airport lounge when he delivered the text to his longtime bandmate. "Love, just shut down," Stamos recalled, stunned into wordless grief, while headlines labeled him the missing mourner. For roughly 26 hours, that silence deepened the decades-old narrative of rivalry. Comment threads seethed, hashtags like "Team Where's Mike Love" trended, and op-eds re-examined lawsuits and political dust-ups. Then, at 8 a.m. on June 12th, Love's verified accounts lit up with a black-and-white childhood photo of himself and Wilson, and the caption, "Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal." Moments later, a brief video montage followed, shot through with Super 8 nostalgia and a closing whisper. "We were inseparable, on stage, off stage, and now, beyond." The post landed minutes before Love stepped onto the Songwriters Hall of Fame stage in New York, where reporters heard him expand on the theme, calling Wilson the soul of our sound, and insisting that even in death, we're inseparable, in life and afterlife. The abrupt pivot, from total radio silence to public elegy, transformed the discourse. Was it belated contrition, calculated timing, or simply the moment grief found words? Whatever the motive, Love's 90-second statement rewrote a day of mourning into the opening scene of a much-watched final chapter in the Beach Boys saga. New York. Within minutes of Brian Wilson's passing hitting the wires on June 11, 2025, radio stations from Sydney to São Paulo dropped regular programming for marathon Beach Boys blocks, and a parade of A-list admirers filled the news cycle. Green Day's Billie Joe Armstrong rushed out an unheard cover of "I Get Around," calling Wilson the chord change king of the century. Sir Paul McCartney, who once labeled Pet Sounds the album that shook the Beatles, posted a midnight selfie clutching his worn vinyl copy, while Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, and Metallica's James Hetfield issued statements crediting Wilson with rewiring modern melody. Even the political class weighed in. California Governor Gavin Newsom hailed Wilson as a state treasure who bottled the sound of Pacific sunlight. From Washington, President Donald J. Trump used Truth Social to salute a true musical genius, right up there with the greatest ever. An unexpected bipartisan note that ricocheted across cable news chyrons. As bouquets piled up outside Capitol Studios in Hollywood, analysts reported a triple-digit spike in Beach Boys catalog streams and vinyl orders, retailers scrambling to restock Pet Sounds by dawn. Industry tracker Music Metrics Vault logged the group's monthly Spotify listeners surging past 18 million, their highest figure in platform history, within 24 hours. The intensity of mourning contrasted sharply with a single conspicuous gap: Mike Love's silence. While tributes from Bob Dylan, Carole King, and Keith Richards cascaded across X and Instagram, reporters noted that the only surviving founding Beach Boy had yet to utter a public word, fueling opinion pieces revisiting decades-old lawsuits and political spats. By nightfall on June 11th, cable panels were asking whether the rift that once split America's most famous surf harmonies would shadow the band's last chapter. The answer, everyone agreed, hinged on whatever Love said or didn't say next. And that cliffhanger set the stage for the 26-hour silence that would soon define the headline. Hawthorne, California. Long before the Grammy Awards, before the lawsuits and split tours, there were just two cousins harmonizing in a modest suburban home, guided by transistor radios and a father's upright piano. Brian Wilson and Mike Love were born into the heart of post-war California, where surfing, hot rods, and vocal harmony were practically second language. Alongside Brian's younger brothers, Dennis and Carl, and neighbor Al Jardine, they formed the Beach Boys in 1961, building what would become one of America's most iconic musical blueprints. From the jump, Wilson and Love made an unlikely but potent team. Wilson, an introverted musical savant, handled composition, production, and arrangements with a meticulous, almost obsessive intensity. Love, by contrast, was extroverted, image-savvy, and a master of crowd-pleasing lyrics, crafting verses that captured the dreams of Southern California youth. Their synergy was lightning in a bottle. Hits like Surfin' Safari, Fun Fun Fun, and California Girls became the anthem of an era, blending Wilson's complex melodic instincts with Love's catchy, radio-friendly delivery. As the Beach Boys climbed the charts, their image solidified. Suntanned harmonizers preaching good vibrations and beachside freedom. But even in the glow of their early success, the seeds of discord were quietly taking root. Behind the grins and matching shirts, Brian's creative appetite was growing restless. The question wasn't if the group would evolve, but whether all of its members would evolve together. Pet Sounds versus Don't Mess with the Formula. Los Angeles. By 1966, the internal chemistry that had once defined the Beach Boys began to mutate. Brian Wilson, now widely considered the band's creative engine, unveiled a project that would change the rules of pop music. Pet Sounds. Fueled by LSD, Phil Spector's wall of sound, and a gnawing desire to outdo Rubber Soul, Wilson disappeared into Capitol Studios with a full orchestra, layers of unconventional instruments, and songs that explored vulnerability, existential doubt, and youthful melancholy. The result was critically hailed, but internally divisive. Mike Love reportedly bristled at what he saw as a departure from their proven surf pop formula, though he later disputed the phrasing. Love's alleged comment, "Don't mess with the formula," became the defining quote of their creative rift. While Wilson yearned to be seen as a serious composer, Love feared alienating the Beach Boys' vast commercial fanbase. That tension grew even more acute when Wilson proposed Smile, an avant-garde follow-up to Pet Sounds that he described as a teenage symphony to God. Sessions for Smile dragged on through 1966 and into 1967, plagued by Wilson's deteriorating mental health and pushback from within the group. Love reportedly dismissed the album as too weird, questioning the cryptic lyrics and experimental soundscapes. The project was ultimately shelved, shattering Wilson's confidence and sending him into a prolonged withdrawal from the band's day-to-day life. Even as the group continued to tour and record, Pet Sounds and Smile had drawn a clear line in the sand. Wilson, the dreamer, wanted to push boundaries. Love, the realist, wanted to keep the lights on. And from that point forward, the Beach Boys were no longer united by vision. They were negotiating a fragile truce between art and commerce. Los Angeles. If the 1960s were a tug-of-war between creative ambition and commercial instincts, the 1990s turned that tension into litigation. By then, Brian Wilson had largely receded from public life, battling mental health challenges and substance dependency, while Mike Love had become the de facto steward of the Beach Boys' public-facing brand. But decades-old songwriting disputes, once brushed aside for the sake of brotherhood or business, finally erupted into open legal warfare. In 1992, Love filed a high-profile lawsuit against Wilson, alleging that he had been denied proper songwriting credit on 35 of the group's biggest hits, including California Girls, I Get Around, and Help Me Rhonda. Love claimed that Murray Wilson, Brian's father and former manager, had improperly submitted publishing paperwork during the group's early years, omitting Mike's name from multiple co-written compositions. The damages were steep. Love demanded both recognition and millions in unpaid royalties. The courtroom became a spectacle, with fans and media watching as two pillars of the Beach Boys turned to opposing counsel. Wilson's defenders saw the case as a betrayal, a calculated move to capitalize on Brian's vulnerability. Love's team framed it differently, a long-overdue correction of industry records that had been mishandled decades earlier. Ultimately, the court ruled in Love's favor, awarding him over $13 million and officially updating the copyright listings to reflect his co-authorship. While the legal win gave Love validation on paper, it came at a steep cultural cost. Headlines dubbed him the Beach Boy who sued his cousin, and critics painted the episode as a cold maneuver against a fragile genius. Music magazines ran side-by-side photos of Brian's wide-eyed detachment and Mike's courtroom smirk, and the public narrative solidified. Brian was the tortured artist, Mike, the aggressive opportunist. The case didn't just settle royalties, it cemented reputations. For many fans, it became the point of no return in a relationship that had once created golden harmonies and now echoed with resentment. And though the two would appear on stage again, the lawsuit left a wound that neither time nor applause would fully heal. Los Angeles. By the late 1990s, the Beach Boys weren't so much a band as a fractured institution. The death of Carl Wilson in 1998 from cancer marked more than the loss of the group's moral center. It signaled the end of any fragile unity left among the founding members. From that point forward, the Beach Boys' name itself became a battleground, one that would split fan loyalty, media coverage, and even ticket sales for years to come. With Carl gone and Brian Wilson retreating further from public performances, Mike Love made a decisive move. He legally secured the exclusive rights to tour under the Beach Boys name, a trademark decision that gave him full control over the brand's public identity. From county fairs to global stages, Love led a touring lineup that often included Bruce Johnston and a rotating cast of younger musicians. On the marquee, it said the Beach Boys, but to many fans, it felt like a tribute band run by its own co-founder. Meanwhile, Brian Wilson, still seen as the heart and soul of the group's genius, began performing under his own name. Though these shows were less frequent, they carried more emotional and artistic weight, especially when Wilson was joined by fellow original member Al Jardine and guitarist David Marks. These concerts were billed as celebrations of Wilson's legacy, often featuring full album renditions of Pet Sounds or The Long-Shelved Smile, finally brought to life in the 2000s. This dual existence confused the public and divided the fan base. Casual listeners bought tickets to the Beach Boys, unaware that Wilson wouldn't be on stage. Devoted fans debated which ensemble carried the real torch. Music critics split hairs in album reviews, op-eds, and retrospectives. All the while, interviews with either side were tinged with barely concealed tension. Love emphasizing the need to keep the brand alive, Wilson insisting on artistic purity over nostalgia. The friction extended beyond stages. Licensing, merchandise, and even charity appearances became opportunities for subtle digs or outright legal maneuvers. When Mike Love appeared on TV as the Beach Boys, Wilson's camp often issued press releases clarifying he wasn't involved. It was a split that wasn't just professional, it was emotional, ideological, and personal. For over a decade, the group that once sold harmony had become a study in dissonance, and while their voices had once blended seamlessly, their paths had never been more out of sync. Los Angeles, in 2012, fans held their collective breath as something once thought impossible became reality. Brian Wilson and Mike Love, along with Al Jardine, David Marks, and even Bruce Johnston, reunited for a one-time 50th anniversary tour of the Beach Boys. For a few months, the group that had defined California pop reunited not only on stage, but in spirit, delivering euphoric performances across sold-out arenas and nostalgic festival circuits. Accompanying the tour was a new album, That's Why God Made the Radio, the first Beach Boys studio release with Wilson since the 1990s. Critics hailed the album as a triumphant return, and for a moment, old wounds seemed on the verge of healing. Brian smiled in interviews. Mike, while still leaning into the familiar branding and stage banter, praised Wilson's involvement. Al Jardine called it the most emotionally satisfying project of our lives. Fans believed a new chapter might be possible, one where grudges gave way to grace. But harmony, as it turned out, had a deadline. Just weeks after the final tour date, Mike Love announced he would continue touring as the Beach Boys, without Wilson, Jardine, or Marks. The abrupt move reignited long smoldering resentments. Many fans and journalists interpreted the decision as a betrayal, with headlines claiming Love had fired Brian just as the reunion had revived public affection. Jardine openly expressed disappointment. Social media exploded. The term cash grab trended. Mike Love pushed back. In a carefully worded statement, he insisted the decision had been contractual, prearranged, and based on logistical realities, not personal animosity. He emphasized that his version of the Beach Boys had obligations to fulfill and that no one had been fired, yet the damage was done. Wilson, visibly disheartened, quietly returned to his solo projects. Jardine and Marks joined him on scattered shows, but the unity that had briefly rekindled was already lost. That short-lived revival now reads like a mirage, beautiful but unsustainable, and the aftermath only reinforced the perception that, while Brian Wilson was the soul of the group, Mike Love remained its business engine, willing to push forward even if it meant pushing others away. The 50th anniversary could have been a full-circle moment. Instead, it became another fracture in a long line of missed reconciliations. Washington, D.C. By the time the Beach Boys name hit a campaign stage in 2020, the rift between its surviving members had spilled far beyond music and into the fault lines of American culture. On a late October evening, Mike Love performed at a fundraiser for then-President Donald Trump, fronting his touring version of the Beach Boys. The event, held near the White House, was part of a larger campaign rally circuit, and instantly ignited a firestorm. Within hours, Brian Wilson and Al Jardine released a joint statement distancing themselves entirely from the performance. "We have absolutely nothing to do with the event, and we were not contacted about it. We do not support using the Beach Boys name for any political agenda." The message was blunt, unapologetic, and carried an undercurrent of long-held tension, not just personal, but ideological. This wasn't the first time Love had embraced Republican circles. He'd performed for Presidents Reagan, Bush Sr., and even at the National Prayer Breakfast. But in the volatile political climate of 2020, aligning with Trump wasn't viewed as nostalgic patriotism. It was a direct shot across a divided cultural battlefield. Love maintained that his appearance was about music, not politics, emphasizing that he believed in playing for anyone who wants to hear the music. But to many, that claim rang hollow. Social media erupted with backlash. Prominent musicians criticized the performance. Hashtags like "You're Not My Beach Boys" gained traction. Petitions were launched demanding Love stop using the Beach Boys name for political events. The controversy reached as far as late-night television and NPR commentary, with pundits debating whether legacy bands should, or could, remain apolitical in modern America. For Wilson fans, the moment reinforced an enduring contrast. Brian, the sensitive visionary artist who rarely made political waves, versus Mike, the pragmatic showman whose decisions often invited outrage. The divide was no longer just about musical direction or old lawsuits. It now carried the full weight of modern polarization. And just like that, the Beach Boys, once the soundtrack to innocent summer romance and surfboard dreams, were now, in part, a political flashpoint. Their legacy, once unified in sound, now seemed split down party lines. London. In an unexpectedly warm BBC interview in late 2024, Mike Love opened a rare window into a relationship long defined by tension. "People think it was always cold between us," he said, speaking softly, "but we saw each other again. Recently, it wasn't as negative as people think." The admission sparked cautious hope. For decades, Wilson and Love had been framed as adversaries, but Love hinted at something more human, perhaps even the possibility of one last collaboration. "If the circumstances were right," he added, "I'd love to make music with Brian again." But that reconciliation never came. As 2025 began, Brian Wilson's health rapidly declined. Still under legal conservatorship, he became increasingly reclusive, his once vivid memory clouded by neurological issues and age. The music press speculated about unreleased recordings, possible memoirs, and the fate of Wilson's extensive archives. Rumors circled that family members were quietly preparing for the inevitable, though no one confirmed anything publicly. Then, on June 11, 2025, the news broke. Brian Wilson had died, age 82. The announcement stunned the music world. For 26 hours, Mike Love remained silent, even as tributes poured in from global figures. The absence was conspicuous, setting social media ablaze with speculation. Was he grieving in private, avoiding backlash, too estranged to speak? Then, just past 8 a.m. on June 12th, Love finally broke his silence with a post that no one expected. A black and white photo of him and Brian as young boys, accompanied by the words, "Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal." It wasn't flashy, it wasn't defensive, and it wasn't followed by a press tour. Just hours later, a 94-second video emerged on Love's official channels. Sitting alone in a quiet room, wearing a black suit, he held a faded 1965 photo of him and Wilson at Capitol Studios. His voice, usually stage-ready and rehearsed, was slow and sincere. "We didn't always agree, but what we created together is undeniable. I didn't just lose a colleague, I lost a brother." The message was simple, but seismic. It marked the first time in decades that Love spoke publicly about Brian without qualifying statements, without defensiveness, without trying to share the spotlight. Critics and fans split down familiar lines. Some applauded the honesty, calling it a rare moment of grace. Others labeled it too little, too late. "Where was this love when Brian needed it?" read one viral comment. But even those skeptical of Love's intentions acknowledged the tone shift. This wasn't the combative love of courtroom counters or campaign controversies. This was a man, 84 years old, staring down the final chapter of his own legacy, finally saying aloud what he hadn't for decades. And at Brian Wilson's private funeral on June 14th, confirmed by family spokespeople, Mike Love was there. He didn't speak, he didn't sing, but his silent presence, after years of estrangement, became its own final note in a song that had never truly ended. Los Angeles. With Brian Wilson gone and Mike Love the sole surviving founder of the Beach Boys, the question of legacy has shifted from history to inheritance, both artistic and literal. Love, now 84, is still on the road, fronting his version of the band to packed summer venues across the US, keeping the hits alive for audiences born decades after the surfboards faded. But in the wake of Wilson's death, that role has taken on new weight and new scrutiny. For generations, Wilson's genius has been carved into the bedrock of modern music. Pet Sounds is studied in conservatories. Smile is whispered about in mythic tones, and critics routinely place Wilson alongside Lennon, McCartney, and Dylan in the pantheon of pop innovators. His passing was met with national tributes, retrospectives, and candlelight vigils. Documentaries, biopics, and university lectures will ensure his vision is never forgotten. Mike Love's legacy, however, remains unresolved. He was the unmistakable voice on Fun Fun Fun, Surfin' USA, and Good Vibrations. He co-wrote many of the band's most beloved lyrics. He kept the Beach Boys' name touring for decades, through cultural shifts, personal losses, and changing lineups. Yet despite this resume, Love has rarely been embraced as the steward of the group's soul. To many, he's the copyright holder, not the composer, the manager, not the muse, the man who sued the genius, not the man who stood beside him when it all began. In recent interviews, Love has acknowledged the imbalance. "I may not be a genius," he once told Rolling Stone, "but without me, those songs wouldn't have been sung, wouldn't have been performed, wouldn't have made it out of the studio." It's not bitterness, it's frustration, a quiet plea for fairness in the annals of pop history. Now, Wilson's absence has left a vacuum. What happens to the unreleased recordings? Who manages the estate's creative decisions? Will there be tribute concerts? And if so, who gets to headline? Love's team has remained publicly quiet, but industry insiders suggest discussions are already underway about archival releases, documentaries, and possibly even AI-enhanced duets using Wilson's old studio stems, a deeply sensitive subject that's already drawing speculation and ethical debate online. Some fans are worried. Will Mike Love control the narrative now that Brian's gone? Others are more hopeful. Maybe finally, the feud is over, and it's time for healing. One thing is certain, the Beach Boys story isn't over, and the next chapter, whether it's told through film, song, or silence, will belong to the last man standing. Whether he chooses to preserve the legacy, reshape it, or step aside remains unclear. But for the first time in over 60 years, Mike Love isn't sharing the mic, and the world is listening. The death of Brian Wilson didn't just close a life, it closed a cultural chapter. For over 6 decades, the Beach Boys were more than a band. They were a paradox of harmony and discord, sunshine and shadows. Wilson, the reclusive genius who heard symphonies in his head, and Mike Love, the showman who kept the group alive on stage, embodied a tension that fueled brilliance and bred bitterness. Their story was never simple, never clean. It was rivalry wrapped in family, music born of conflict. Now, with Wilson gone and Love left as the last voice of the original lineup, that legacy feels both fragile and immense. In life, they struggled to reconcile their visions. In death, they are inseparable in memory. One defined what was possible in the studio. The other made sure those songs reached the crowd. And neither legacy is complete without the other. For fans, the loss of Brian Wilson is immeasurable. But so is the burden now placed on Mike Love to honor, to preserve, and perhaps finally, to understand. His tribute wasn't perfect. His silence at first spoke louder than words. But in the end, he did speak. He showed up. And in doing so, he reminded the world that history isn't just written by the survivors. It's shaped by how they choose to carry the story forward. Because when the music fades, what's left isn't just who sang what or who wrote what, but who had the courage to look back, admit the pain, and still keep singing. The Beach Boys may never reunite again, but their echoes will.